Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brittany Mitchell from the Institute for Community Inclusion speaking, and welcome to today's webinar from the Access for All series. This webinar is titled Home for All, Financing Affordable, Accessible Housing and Community Facilities. We have a great presentation scheduled for you today, but before we get started, I'd like to walk you through a few tips for how to best utilize the Zoom platform. If it's your first time using Zoom, you might notice the chat box. In the chat box, I've typed in a test comment that says, welcome. Please type your questions and comments here. Please feel free to type any questions or comments you have throughout the presentation into the chat box, and someone will read your questions and comments aloud and address them. In addition, you might notice a raise hand feature. In the event that you have any technical difficulties or would like me to chat with you directly, please feel free to raise your hand or type into the chat box, and I will do my best to address you. Speaking of the chat box, if you notice, there is a drop-down box that allows you to indicate who your message is directed towards. There's an option to select all panelists or all panelists and attendees, or send your message directly to someone. My name is Brittany Mitchell. So again, if you have any technical issues or any other concerns that you'd like to address with me directly, please feel free to select my name in the chat box and I will get back to you as soon as possible. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to the full group, please be sure to select all panelists and attendees so that we can all see and respond to your questions and concerns. This webinar is also being live captioned. If you click on the CC captioning icon, you should be able to see the captions being broadcasted at the bottom of your screens. This webinar is also being recorded and will be distributed and shared with the public at a later date. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Ms. Tanisha Washington from BCT Partners.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining, for participating in this training. BCT Partners is a small business based in Newark, New Jersey. We have a corporate mission to bring about a more equitable society, and in doing so, we engage in primarily contracts with the federal government, such as Department of Treasury on this Access for All training series, whereby we are helping to meet the needs of disenfranchised people. This particular training series is, of course, focused on to better serving people with disabilities. In the process of that, BCT has engaged with various subject matter experts and business partners to develop the best possible training that we can deliver to you. And we certainly appreciate our trainers and our customer Department of Treasury, and hope that you get a great deal out of this Access for All training series. You can advance to the slide with our presenters, and I will turn the microphone over to them to begin the training. Thank you again for your attendance.
Thank you, Tanisha. So welcome, everyone. I'll introduce the instructors. So my name is Carla Mannings, and I am with Partners for the Common Good as the Chief Business Development Officers. All four of us, we are all board members of the National Disability Finance Coalition. So if you'd like to learn more about the National Disability Finance Coalition, please reach out to one of us. Presenting on the panel today, we have Lisa Bolden-Williams. She's with IFF. She's the Director of Universal Access Services. We also have Charlie Hammerman, who is the President and CEO of Disability Opportunity Fund. And we also have Susan Tachaw, which is, she is the CEO of Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation. To introduce what we're going to talk about today, people with disabilities face unique housing challenges. And this webinar will examine the roles that CDFIs can play in creating and or supporting housing options for this population. So this webinar will contain a few different topics. One, we will talk about, we'll provide a summary of the unique housing challenges faced by people with disabilities. We will also provide you with information on smart homes, assistive technology, and energy assistance. Also, we will discuss an array of housing opportunities and choices for people with disabilities. And also there will be a discussion of community integrated versus campus style housing. So if you're not familiar with those terms, stay tuned. We have a lot to say about that. We will also specifically talk about, as we're going throughout the webinar this next 2 hours, we'll talk about ways that CDFIs of all types that provide different types of products can support people with disabilities. In particular, with this webinar, we're focusing on housing. And then last but not least, we will provide case studies of CDFIs that have led targeted initiatives where people of disabilities have benefited from. Okay, next slide. So now we will talk about the housing challenges. So Lisa, can you please provide us with a summary of the challenges that people with disabilities face in terms of housing?
Sure, thanks, Carla. People with disabilities face many of the same types of housing challenges that our folks without disabilities face. Affordability is a challenge in a lot of markets, but layered on top of that are the outstanding challenges of accessibility and discrimination among landlords and against people with disabilities. So I'm going to walk us through each of these three elements to explain a little bit more about them. Just finding accessible housing can be a significant challenge for people with disabilities. If you think about the type of housing in your own community, how many of the houses or townhomes or apartment buildings or condos in your neighborhood are accessible to someone who uses a wheelchair or another mobility device? Now, since 1991, the Fair Housing Act has required all new multifamily housing to be accessible for people with disabilities. However, anything built before 1991 is exempt, as are single-family homes and owner-occupied rentals of 4 units or less, which are unfortunately often referred to as walk-ups. But again, if you picture the most affordable housing in your community, if you think about it, if you can think about where it is, it's likely in older neighborhoods, it's older apartment buildings or single-family homes, which have been grandfathered in under fair housing. They're not required to be accessible. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's a problem in a minute. Disability is one of 7 protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act. Unfortunately, disability has replaced race as the single largest category of complaints of housing discrimination. In 2017 alone, nearly 60% of all housing discrimination complaints filed with HUD were based on disability. Within these complaints, 2/3 of the issues were around reasonable accommodation. Clearly, a lot of landlords don't understand their requirements under the law to make reasonable accommodations that meet the needs of a renter with a disability. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. If your CDFI lends to housing developers or operators, here are some steps you can take to combat discrimination. Make sure your staff members understand fair housing so they can ask the right questions. A quick Google search will connect you with free fair housing training resources online for your team. There's also training and technical assistance available for borrowers at www.fairhousingfirst.org. Under the Fair Housing Act, housing providers must make reasonable accommodations and allow reasonable modifications necessary to allow persons with disabilities to enjoy their housing. Fair housing also applies to banks and other lenders, home insurance companies, as well as housing providers like real estate agencies, realtors, and landlords. It's important to point out that discrimination protection applies to any disability, whether it be a physical disability, a mental health disability, or alcoholism or drug addiction. All of these are protected under the Fair Housing Act. So what types of accessible features are required under the Fair Housing Act? Accessibility standards, which can be found online, include accessible routes that are clear and wide, accessible entrances, whether that's via a ramp, a lift, an automatic door opener, or being built at grade, doors that are wide enough for wheelchairs, bathrooms that are large enough for a wheelchair turning radius or that have grab bars, thermostats, light switches, and outlets at a height that all can reach, and common spaces that can be enjoyed by all. And I want to add here that if you think about what those design elements can accomplish, that makes the space accessible for all, right? It means not only someone who has a disability, but maybe a senior who might really appreciate having grab bars in the bathroom, or a mom or a dad with a stroller who wants to be able to get in and out easily. So these are standards that can make the housing accessible to everyone. You know, a lot of times people get Fair Housing Act and the ADA confused, right? Because you hear ADA a lot, you hear fair housing a little bit less frequently. So the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act are both federal civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities. But they're focused on two different areas, and they do have different accessible design and construction requirements. The ADA prohibits discrimination against persons with disabilities in all areas of public life, including employment, education, transportation, public accommodations, communications, and access to state and local government programs and services. Newly constructed buildings and alterations to existing buildings must comply with the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. Also, the ADA addresses removing barriers in the built environment to ensure equal access to programs and services. The Fair Housing Act, on the other hand, prohibits discrimination against individuals when they are specifically renting, purchasing, or financing a home. So for the purpose of this presentation today, we will be focusing on the Fair Housing Act.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for clarifying that. So now we'll turn to Susan, and she will talk about smart home technology and energy assistance. And this will go beyond what the ADA and FHA compliance. So take it away, Susan.
Thank you. So the first slide, the next slide, please. We're talking about smart home technology and what is it? And basically, the reason we're including smart home and smart devices is these are devices that can help people who are interested in housing provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities and seniors, as well as enhance someone's safety and independence. Smart home devices, as many of us have heard, is really a popular term that's used to describe how, popular term in the real world of how you describe sensors and appliances, how they will be connected in the cloud, making it possible for them to communicate and to be controlled wirelessly. So one of the tips here is that most of the smart home devices, they are using the internet. Therefore, obviously, one of the other kind of terms is called the Internet of Things. And people with disabilities, unfortunately, are kind of running behind the general public in accessing smart home devices, and yet they can provide a whole host of possibilities so someone can move into a home that is more accessible to them or age in place. The next slide, please. Here are some common terms, just so that you're aware of some of the words that may be thrown around. And if you are interested in learning more and having more definitions, whether it's called home automation versus smart home versus environmental controls, there's a website that several of us in Pennsylvania helped create called smarthomesmadesimple.org. And we created a dictionary, the whole purpose of which is to make sure that we're talking a common language. So when you're talking with people with disabilities, there are all the support folks around them. So you may have therapists, and many therapists will call smart home devices environmental controls. If you are talking to contractors, you're often talking about home automation. If you're talking about people who are getting most of their information from the media, you're going to hear about smart home devices. But anyway, in general, as I mentioned, smart devices are items that connect to each other through networks, often through a smartphone or a tablet. Bridges are devices that connect multiple items in the same kind of nature, such as light bulbs, and they can be controlled by a single point, also called an association. A hub is very popular, and they're getting more and more sophisticated. For example, the Wink hub is one of the universal hubs that are sold on market. It was taken off, it's back on, and the virtue of a hub is that it can connect many different products together through a range of manufacturers, so you're not stuck with any one, and it can help make these devices streamlined and controlled in a single device. A smart speaker, that's Amazon Echo and the Google Homes, and the whole automation service, again, this is where you come from contractor language. It's software that allows you to automate the behavior of the smart devices based on conditional statements. Many people have questions around security of these devices. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. But if you're interested in learning more deeply about some of the security issues, what is real, what's not real, how to protect yourself, again, I would go to the website smarthomesmadesimple.org. Next slide, please.
If I may make two comments. One is, if you all have questions, please be sure to use the chat feature to ask the questions as we go along. We'll also have an opportunity at the end of the presentations to have a Q&A session. But if you have a question that you want to ask now, please do so. Also, the slides have a wealth of information, and so we will be sure to provide you with a copy of the slides after this presentation. So, no need to do screenshots. You will get a copy of the presentation. Okay. Thanks, Susan. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Carla. So I'm going to speak to two of these types of financing products, and then Lisa and Charlie are going to speak up on the third one. CDFIs can have a direct role with smart technology in several ways. One is through small business lending. people are creating new devices all the time. I'm sure all of us live in areas of universities, for example, little small businesses where you've got people who have brilliant ideas and are working to create something new. In Pittsburgh, very recently in the last year, they created a new smart cane, which will allow someone who is blind or has low vision cross the street. And our role in this was connecting these brilliant young people to the disability community so you could find out what other benefits could there be to having a smart cane, or what's something to look out for. So there's the role both in consulting and also bringing people to the table. There are consumer lending products that we can create, including assistive technology loan products. So all of you, or most of you, have been to the in-person meetings. Our Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation is an assistive technology loan fund. So Smart Home falls under that category, but there are also other CDFIs who do consumer lending, such as Self-Help Credit Union, and there were several others in Philadelphia, I remember. One of the differences, and I would think about this when you're getting into consumer lending, is many of the assistive technology programs provide loans for smart home and they're unsecured. Some of the consumer lending programs, they're securing many of their products, and I would just look at, you know, the complication added to if you're securing some of these products, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But it's very simple to give a microloan for smart home, and you've helped someone make their home accessible, or we're helping give developers financing so that they are integrating smart home as they're building new housing.
So,
you can layer, yes?
Oh, I'm sorry, keep going. We have a question.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right, I will get right there after I do my layered financing. There's another funding resource, and that is the United States Department of Agriculture. They have a couple of different programs, but if you go on the USDA website, you can read in greater detail. Two of the programs that USDA, Department of Agriculture, have is one is they have a housing repair loan and grant program, so that if a loan for us, for example, would be for assistive technology and home modifications, but we are not there to finance a new roof, USDA can provide the 1% loan out 20 years, for example, for the repair. They also have the United States Department of Agriculture has another program in rural areas. It's called Section 504 for people who are 62 and older, and they provide grants of up to $7,500 and loans up to $20,000, 20 years at 1%. So in terms of the ability of putting together a package that is as affordable as possible for low-income people with disabilities, it is very possible to layer these products, and someone will, you know, the outcome is you've got housing that works for them, that is safe, secure, and someone can be independent. Let's see, Lisa, and I can answer a question now, or Lisa or Charlie, do you want to talk about the affordable housing loans?
Yes, Lisa or Charlie, can you talk more about the housing loans? I wanted to get a little bit more information from the person that asked the question so that we can be sure to answer her very specifically. So Charlie, Lisa, you want to chime in on affordable housing loans? Okay. Well,
I think, Charlie, this is more in your wheelhouse. Did you want to talk about it at all?
Well, let me just add this about this. In terms of the role that CDFIs can play with affordable housing loans is that when we are working with our clients or the developers or our borrowers, some of the things that we can do is, one, we can encourage that the borrowers include this smart technology within the projects that they're doing. And then, of course, this also calls for additional funds. And so there are ways that we could either help in terms of providing technical assistance to those borrowers in terms of how to come up with their pro forma to add this cost, and then also help them think of ways to layer on that financing piece for this as well. Um, Another thing, and that can be for rehab loans as well as new construction. And also this applies for single as well as multifamily types of projects. And so the other thing that we can do is, just like how all of you are on this call to educate yourselves as to the possibilities, it is important for us as an industry to educate ourselves of the possibilities of what this smart technology is. So I would say that we can start today with the people on this call is that, one, you provide this information to your staff at your various CDFIs, and then two, look for ways in terms of how do you layer on that financing, either yourselves or help them find a source for the financing.
Great.
Okay.
Next slide.
Okay, before you go to that next slide, let's see, the question that was asked was, Susan, it was asked of you when you were talking about consumer loans in terms of the assistive technology loans, is there was something that you said that this person wanted you to repeat and to give more information on. I don't have exactly what it was that was to be repeated, but did you provide any type of, I don't know, I think you were talking about the various CDFIs when you mentioned self-help. So can you please tell us those CDFIs again that you mentioned earlier?
Well, yes, but let me give a couple of resources again, and then this is audio taped and you can listen again. That's the beauty of these things. But the resources would be smarthomesmadesimple.org. There are organizations doing consumer lending who also do assistive technology lending, and they have different products. Self-Help Credit Union being one. David Beck is somebody from Self-Help Credit Union out of North Carolina that you might want to talk with, because I know that they do a separate product for consumer lending from assistive technology. In their wheelhouse, what they're doing with assistive technology is keeping them all very low interest, I believe 4%, without the fees and without making a security there for smart home. And then for the United States Department of Agriculture, I would check on their website, because you will find out many of their rural development programs, including the USDA Housing Repair Loan and Grant Program and the Section 504 program. And if you want to talk offline, I'm happy to do so. So the next slide.
And real quick, we had one other question that came in, and that question was, and Charlie, if you want to answer this question, or I can tackle it as well. And the question is that as a developer, how do I get the funding that is uncomplicated, easy, and quick to access? Are there grants that a developer can get to build multifamily housing that includes smart technology? And so let me give a first stab at it, and Charlie, if you want to chime in, please do.
And I can chime in on that as well.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
All righty. So the one thing we'll get to this slide later on. But one of the resources is your state housing finance agency. And just in terms of connecting with them to see what resources they have and to work with your other local governments to see what types of programs that they have. Uncomplicated, easy, and quick to access. That, I don't know about how uncomplicated, easy, and quick to access it is, but that is a resource. So Lisa, go ahead.
I have to second everything you just said now that I've sort of stopped giggling. I have spent my entire career looking for resources that are quick, easy to access, and uncomplicated. They're wherever the unicorns are, and at the end of the rainbow. Unfortunately, if doing this was quick and easy, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are in. Everybody would love to house people with disabilities. The challenge is putting the stacks together that make this work. We will talk a little bit more about layered financing later, but it's not quick, it's not easy. When it comes to smart technology, a lot of times cities or states will have special funds available for the technology. But when it comes to developing the housing itself, it generally does require something like your, as Carla said, your housing agency that's in the state. Your housing finance agency here in Illinois, it's IDA. But they are a key partner in this, for better or worse.
Thank you.
Okay, so here, oh, did Charlie, is that you?
No, go ahead, Susan.
Okay, so here are some examples of some of the smart home devices that people have purchased through the AT programs, or the people or some of the contractors we are working with the redevelopment authorities here in Pennsylvania. So thermostats, and that's obviously to be able to control someone's temperature, lights and outlets, smoke alarms, door locks. Very important about door locks. What we learned in the Philadelphia area, we did a study and discovered that many, many people with disabilities were living with their doors always open for two reasons. One, so that attendants could come and go as they pleased, and otherwise, also so that deliveries could be made and the package not be left outside. So door locks are really important, and smart door locks. And you can add for the security, not just voice, but add a PIN, so that if someone were outside and saying, Alexa, open the front door, the next question is, what's your PIN number? So I'm just adding that. Doorbells, robotic vacuum cleaners, garage doors, curtains, shades, and blinds, being able to control the blinds by yourself. Carbon monoxide detectors, motion detectors, security cameras, ovens, refrigerators, all of those kinds of devices. They can all be integrated into a home and controlled through Wi-Fi on a smartphone or a tablet. And the other advantage to this is that, someone else remotely can also be of assistance here. Next slide, please.
Can you hear me? It's Charlie.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So one, I was just making sure everyone can hear me. Two, I think I'm watching the chat room, and the person that was asking this question, I believe, is from the state of Indiana, and we have some experience there. So if you want to reach me offline, and I could talk about if the project you're thinking about is in that state, we can do that offline, if that's helpful.
Thanks, Charlie.
Okay, so the three pictures that I have on this slide are examples of both consumer lending and also working with the housing developer. So the picture on the left of Saria, who's a wheelchair user on her ramp, you may notice on the left-hand side of her door and upper door, she has a Ring doorbell and a camera. So she is able to, and she also, which is difficult for you to see, she has a smart door lock. So Saria has a spinal cord injury, but she is able to come and go from her home and allow others to come and go with those three pieces of technology, of a smart door lock that also has a sensor, so she can open it. She can see who's at the door, actually on the street. This is a picture in Philadelphia, so she wanted something beyond her ramp, but who is also around her on her street. And then the camera in the corner. To the right of Saria is a picture of 3 switches. Those are smart switches. And so one of the redevelopment authority people that we work with in rural Pennsylvania, while they are doing new home construction for low-income people and people with disabilities, they are automatically putting in the smart switches, which if you then have a lamp connected, as an example, to that smart switch, that lamp can be turned on and off both by using your voice and by using this switch. And of course, it's cheaper than retrofitting. And the reason why switches have an advantage over just using a smart light bulb and using your tablet or smartphone is that other people, if they're using the switch, would break that connection. So it's just, it's something we would recommend that in new home construction or retrofitting, that the electrician put in smart switches. Below that picture is another, something that some of the developers are using, and we've also given consumer loans for, and that's just a strip of lights that can also be controlled by your phone or your iPhone. So it's lighting under the kitchen counter in this case, and it just brightens up the whole kitchen. Next slide, please. The next section is energy assistance, and CDFIs have a role in this as well. And if you're creating new housing, retrofitting housing, of course, energy assistance is something that all of us can benefit knowing what those resources are. And oftentimes low-income seniors and disabilities, if they are having issues around affording heat and air conditioning, they make choices that may not be the safest thing for their homes or for themselves. So we all know about heat, but remember air conditioning is also important so that people who have difficulty regulating internally their heat, many low-income, many seniors have this issue, but also people with other disabilities, including people with MS, ALS, familial dysautonomia. Those are all kind of autoimmune diseases as well. So one of the areas that a website that can provide a lot of assistance is the United States Department of Energy website. You can plug in your state and find out, you know, where the locus is for the weatherization agency, as Carla talked about a few minutes ago, Community and Economic Development. That's certainly the key agency in Pennsylvania. In Washington State, it's like the Washington State Department of Commerce, Kentucky Department of Community-Based Services. So every state has a different name, but if you go on the U.S. Department of Energy website, you will find out where you can get LIHEAP services, weatherization, energy assistance, etc. And if someone comes to you, presents to you, an individual, for example, what benefits are they eligible for? How would they access them? There's one other website that I would recommend so that you do not have to have the deep knowledge about whether someone is eligible for LIHEAP, but the National Council on Aging has a website, Benefits Checkup. And if you they walk you through what's your zip code, you know, all of the particulars, and then they will have concrete contact information about programs and how to contact those programs so that someone will get the support and be able to afford to live in the house that they want, the home that they want. Next section, please. And lastly, do CDFIs have a role with energy assistance? And the answer is a resounding yes. This is a field of real growth, as we all know, and looking at this week's new crisis around oil. So improving the energy efficiency of housing, businesses, community facilities can transform lives and communities by lowering operating costs, creating green-collar jobs, and reducing carbon emissions. So this is a real area of employment. So new self-employment, small business employment is all around energy assistance. Energy efficiency is a growing sector. In what areas do we see right away? Solar energy, looking at lighting and weatherization, insulation, looking at other renewable resources. For example, there are 3 sections of Pennsylvania right now that are really booming in wind energy, another small business opportunity. And these, of course, all lead to reduced utility bills for building owners, lower rents for tenants, and, you know, making our environment a cleaner, long-lasting place for all of us. So we can move on to affordability, and if anyone has any questions, I can answer them in the chat room. We can go offline.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Affordability. Housing affordability is a national issue for a lot of citizens here in the United States. And this is especially true for people with disabilities. This population often has fixed incomes, of which they typically, that income does not cover the cost of a 1-bedroom apartment. So they start off in terms of being able to afford a home in the negative with the fixed income. And then, so this is a statistic on this slide. According to 2015 data, the median income for an American adult without disabilities was close to $32,000. So this is actually 47, almost 48% more for the same age group with people with disabilities, which is $22,000 rounded. And then to make that even more clear, the number for a person in poverty is at $13,000 a year. So if you can imagine living on $13,000 a year, that's poverty. And then just imagine living on $22,000 with needs. That's really tough. Okay, so next slide. So here, in terms of housing, unemployment, and disabilities, we have a loop that could be an endless loop. So housing impacts employment opportunities, and then employment impacts housing opportunities. And the cycle can just keep going on and on. So the unemployment rates for workers with disabilities was more than doubled of those of non-disabled workers in 2018. So to give you a statistic of where we stand in 2019 data. So according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2019, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. For people with disabilities, it was 7.3%. So that's actually more than doubled. Then if you break it up in by race, the statistics gets more interesting. For African Americans, the unemployment rate with people with disabilities is at 11.8%, Hispanic 8.6%, Asian 6.7%, and white 6.6%. And then also to look at this, adults with disabilities experience poverty nearly twice the rate as non-disabled counterparts, and that's triple the rate if the person with disabilities is a woman or female. So very interesting statistics here, I believe. Okay, so now we're going to go into some housing opportunities. Those statistics were kind of grim, but we as CDFIs and others in the industry are doing things to improve situations. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlie, and Charlie will talk about housing opportunities. So Charlie, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Just make sure everyone can hear me. I'm good?
Yes, you're great.
All right, thanks. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. And looking at the attendees, a lot of the folks I've known for a while and such, I'm a little embarrassed because some of you could do this presentation just as well because you've really been involved in this arena. And for those who I don't know, we want to just make sure everybody on this call knows that this is a touch point on a lot of these issues, and therefore, if you learn anything and you want to follow up on anything, you're going to have our contact information, and this isn't just the one and done. You can always follow up, and we'll always be able to sort of help out. Can we just go to the next slide? So what we're trying to explain in these few slides, which are really going to lead us right into some examples. We picked a single-family home, we picked some multifamily, and we're going to talk about, sort of some substance abuse issues. It's just to explain, which has already been touched upon a couple of times, it's just there are multiple ways to get something done. We've actually employed some of these that you see on the list here in terms of the HUD programs. Some are they have Section 8 and HAP and 811s. We've been able to utilize the Fannie Mae program. The Habitat for Humanity is going to be one of the examples I'm going to explain. And when we talk about Social Security, SSI, and SSDI, it's really a function of explaining how you can utilize those incomes for debt service on a project, and we'll explain some of that as well. And finally, there's not only grants, but veterans are also able to get mortgages at banks based on their eligibility. Next slide. So here is a case study in which we utilized a whole bunch of different resources here on Long Island. You're going to see that the loan that we did was very small relative to some of the normal loans that we do. And in this case, in this situation, we were able to manage other functions of resources to be able to get this done. So in terms of the unit, it was one house. This was a house that was in foreclosure, and the family that's doing the cutting there, and the young man smack in the middle was a young man with autism, and his parents, who are on either side of him, wanted to acquire this house, which was only 2 doors away from their house, but they're not wealthy people, and they couldn't do it on their own, so they approached us and said, could you help us figure out how to acquire this house and be able to have it not just for our son, but for other people with disabilities. And the mom, whose name is Karen, wanted to begin providing technical assistance to other families out of that house. In this situation, what we were able to do is we took the Fannie Mae discussion with the bank that had the house under foreclosure. We were able to do a loan modification. So in essence, we provided a lot of technical assistance to the family And in this case, they created Karen's Hope as a not-for-profit, a 501c3. So in this case, the 501c3 was going to be the owner of the deed, but there was a very unusual situation, which was that Fannie Mae wasn't able, there were no rules or no precedent, so to speak, for Fannie Mae to transfer an individual mortgage over into the name of a not-for-profit or otherwise. And we provided a tremendous amount of technical assistance between all the parties to sort of convince Fannie Mae to move this mortgage over. And they ultimately did get a loan modification that extended the mortgage out to almost 40 years and reduced the interest that was going to be due. Nevertheless, you still had to pay a mortgage. And what we were able to do was then on the other side of the coin, work with the state of New York that handles people with disabilities and be able to get their rent payment and their monthly stipend to equal that of the mortgage payment. So in essence, based on 3 people living in the house, you have a mortgage, that mortgage is getting paid off. The beautiful part was also is that as part of that mortgage, there was what all mortgages have, a tax number as well as an insurance number. Well, over the course of time, because it was a not-for-profit, we were able to also get Nassau County, the local county, to alleviate the taxes since it was being owned, property taxes since it was being owned by a not-for-profit. So the beautiful part is that as of now, which has been a few years at this point, there's actually an overage in terms of what the monthly income is over what the expenses are, and it's really, really nice for the future. In the case of the actual house itself, it was a disaster. The reason there's a ribbon cutting there is because the house that was in foreclosure was, sort of coming down. And what we were able to do is bring 2 other resources to the table. We were able to bring Habitat for Humanity to the table to help, this is not a typical Habitat project, and we were able to bring them to the table to give free labor. And then we used other HUD money that's in the locality called home funds, and we got that released into the hands of the not-for-profit, and that really built up this beautiful home that you're looking at because we were able to get the materials and everything paid for. So a little bit of this, a little bit of that. There was still a gap of about $65,000. We provided that last piece of the loan on a subordinated basis, and that loan has since been paid off almost 2 years at this point, and the house is doing great. And this is a great example of taking a situation, you take demand and you take supply, you sort of use a little cuteness in terms of what CDFIs like to do in terms of, manipulate whatever resources you have, and now you have, a beautiful situation that has been replicated and can be replicated, going forward. Any questions on this? Obviously, you'll let us know as the webinar is going on, or if you want to get me offline, no problem. Next slide, please.
So, Charlie, I actually have a question for you.
Sure.
In terms of how you put this together with all the different partners, I can imagine that some CDFIs that are getting into this work may say, well, that's a lot of partners and a lot of people that they have to get to know. What advice would you give to a CDFI in terms of how do you find all of those various partners to help your end borrower?
So it's a great question, Carla. I mean, the point is that, look, this was a labor of love for us. I mean, for all the CDFIs on the phone, you do the math on $65,000 loan. We didn't make any money on this loan. In fact, once we do a loan loss reserve on it, it really wasn't a moneymaker. So there are going to be these situations where you take something like this, and that really becomes more of our work. We hope that CDFIs of sort of a technical assistance challenge, but it also helps set the table why more of these can happen on a broader scale, and we've taken it to that level. So in terms of where you find the resources or what you need to do, I didn't know any of these resources. I mean, I basically kept digging and digging and digging, and I was very tenacious. I mean, Fannie Mae was not in the mood to hear another phone call from me. And the bank that, which I will not name, but the bank that had the mortgage on this house is one that we had a relationship with. And I had to talk to their people in Texas because that's where the foreclosure and loan modification department was. And they didn't know me personally, but we were, again, very tenacious on behalf of the end borrower here and trying to use common sense. So I think it's a multi-layered answer of saying, look, if you end up trying to find the resources either yourself or because you're able to communicate with I always like concentric circles. So you start local. Let's assume it's New York. You have county, and then you have village, and then county, and then state, and then to go to federal programs. I know we have some people on the phone that were interested in USDA. Well, USDA, you don't go to Washington to call USDA. You go to your local because each of them have their own local offices. And they're very networked in terms of what's going on. So I don't know if that answered your question, Carla, but it was more of a sense of, look, it wasn't like we just opened up the phone book and said, oh, here are the resources. In this particular case, we had to dig and dig and dig, but at least we kept a playbook. So therefore, when we did another one of these, we sort of knew, how to attack it and how to teach others how to attack it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right, next slide. All right, so now we're going to give you an example about multifamily. I see a lot of the folks and the attendees on this call. I know you have some experience on multifamily. For those who don't, again, there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different programs that are available. Some fit, some don't fit. I mean, Capital Magnet Fund. It definitely is a wonderful, housing program. Typically, Capital Magnet Fund in the past has been really for big multifamily projects. We were very fortunate, and then it has happened a number of times now where the CDFI fund has been financing scattered site single-family homes, which is really a nice model for getting people with disabilities to live in the community. And they've been very, very supportive of that as well. Bond guarantee program, obviously that's big dollars, but clearly can be used. And again, we're back to that same basis of the state, local funds, private foundations. And the state and the local funds, again, it requires patience, but it also, you never know. You just never know what's happening politically. So we did a project in Baltimore. We are involved in a project in Baltimore County. And while Baltimore County is very different than Baltimore City, but as we're working harder and harder and harder on Baltimore County and locally, and they were providing resources to our borrower to be able to renovate some of the houses and have stipends in terms of rental, all of a sudden, it took us almost 4 years of continuing to finance this borrower. We kept recycling money, and all of a sudden, the state of Maryland came in and said, oh, we have a whole bunch of money where we finance. We could we could be the first mortgage on something like, 40-year paper at like 4%. And again, it was just sort of a sense, there was no phone book for me to look up and say, hey, why don't we call the state of Maryland? It took some time for us to have success, and all of a sudden somebody at the state of Maryland found out what was going on and like, wait, we could get involved here. And all of a sudden it made the whole model, made our money expensive, which was great. And all of a sudden now you have the state of Maryland coming in to replace us, and we were like, wow, this is exactly the kind of work we love doing. So again, this is a good slide. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about the one example we have here. So,
Go back
one, please. There we go. Yeah, so this is moving out. They're a not-for-profit developer. They're a mortgage provider. I think this story is the original loan that we did to them, because you're looking at Elvinstead, we actually just closed another loan to them many years later. But in this case, again, it's the sense of what are we trying to achieve with multi-family housing. It's really what the communities come to us with their ideas. And in this case, it was 33 units, and it was a third, a third, a third. It was a third of people with disabilities, a third of the working poor, and basically having affordable housing just in general as the other third. Great model. What did we provide in this case? We were just providing the pre-development dollars, very high risk, difficult for a not-for-profit to show up at a bank and say, hey, give us this money. What we did in this case was an interesting situation. We found a bank locally that wanted to use this as their assessment area. So in this case, they didn't want to underwrite the loan directly. They underwrote a PRI to us, but it was limited to this particular project. And therefore, we turned around and we wrote the loan to moving out. And once the money got paid back to us, we paid back the PRI, and it really set a nice precedent for everybody, because it showed that that moving out could pay us back, showed that we could pay the bank back. And in the many years since we did this original loan, we've done other transactions with the bank, and as I just explained, we just did another pre-development loan to them for a different project. And I would also tell you, in the pre-development loan we just closed, we invited in another CDFI, because there was another CDFI that had received a disability finance award from the CDFI fund last year. And this is in their area, their geographic area. So we were able to bring them in. We did a 50% participation with them. So they feel like they're now involved in disability finance, which was not one of their sort of main focuses. And now it just gave us another partnership with another CDFI. So a lot of stories out of this one little example, but again, just to show you an example of how multifamily is a great market too. It doesn't have to be big. Here's 33 units, and you can still be very effective in what you're doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a whole world that we just got ourselves involved in over the last, I would say, 2 years. So I'm going to be very colloquial for half a second and explain that when you think about drug abuse, and I'm sure there are a lot of attendees on this call that may get involved in supportive housing and other things, we all sort of get a sense that for those not in the CDFI world and those not sort of in the more sensitive aspect, drug abuse and substance abuse is more of a criminal, aspect. It was, you get arrested, you get put into jail rather than getting, better treatment or being empathetic to what the situation is. In the last couple of years, we've had a tremendous amount of data and conversations with experts to really move the conversation towards disabilities. That why are people using opioids? Well, now they're looking at the brain, right? And why did they go ahead and try to, whether it's on a pain management standpoint, if it's a mental health issue. So there's a lot more empathy and sensitivity towards the aspect that more solutions are needed in terms of whether it's housing or support systems and such. So we have really thrown ourselves into this. If there's anybody on this webinar who wants more information or wants to share with us what they're doing, we will be more than happy to talk to them. We have thrown as our CDFI, we've thrown ourselves into the state of West Virginia very heavily right now, the highest death rate per 100,000 people on opioids, and we're learning a lot. And we're also learning what the communities want to do to respond to it, and what basically the people with disabilities need. And we're working really hard. Next slide. Okay, here are just some statistics for you. 10% of adults in general population are affected by alcohol, 5% problems with drugs, and by comparison, people with disabilities experience drug or alcohol problems at 2 to 4 times the rate of the general population. Next slide, please. So these are some of the obstacles that we've been learning about and that we're trying to deal with. How do you combine not just a treatment center, but how do you combine it with people with disabilities and getting them access to it? So a lot of the things, obviously, I don't need to read this to you, but I would also tell you, combining some of the stuff that Susan was talking about with assistive technology, telemedicine is a very large component all of a sudden, especially in the rural areas, in terms of trying to deal with treatment and health issues. Imagine what we're all going through right now with the virus and people being in their homes, and they don't want people to run to the hospital and such. Well, then how do you take care of people? And for people with disabilities, it's one level higher, right? And I would tell you that technology is going to be a very, very big player in terms of what you're going to see in the future with regard to recovery / people with disabilities. Next slide. So this is my slide, right? Am I still on doing this one? So in terms of supportive housing projects, again, it was a very wide term for many years, and I think that it is finally getting more defined as to what is supportive housing. What do you and do you define it as the housing or the person? And that, I think, is going to be the big driver, moving forward in terms of what you're seeing on this slide, where, it's not about this unit or that unit, but it's about the concept of locations and can we create more permanent solutions so that there are supportive housing in the physical location so that someone doesn't have to be transitory. We were involved with something very interesting in Arizona where the whole, even though it was affordable housing, the 70 units were all designed for people who are hard of hearing, and you weren't forced to live there, but if you wanted to live there, it was a great social experience because the whole building was basically tricked out with technology and everything that would be able to support someone who is hard of hearing or deaf to be able to have a nice existence. Now, something as simple as, then, some people may not think about, I didn't even think about it until I was there looking at it. They had in the community room where people would get together and, play cards or whatever it is, they had round tables, not a square table. And they pointed out to me that the reason there was a round table is because people who have hard of hearing who want to do sign or need to communicate to each other or lip read, that's the methodology that works best for them. So again, talking about permanent supportive housing shouldn't just be a broad brush in terms of everything. It's basically a function of trying to figure out what is going to be good for the person to be able to have a good experience. Recovery housing is something, again, we're starting to learn about. Sober homes is sort of the nomenclature, and the question is which ones work, which ones don't work, where should they be located, are they located in the community, are they tied into a job? So again, it's not about putting a bunch of people in one house, locking the door, and you hope for the best. It's this comprehensive, so when you see recovery housing, don't think about the house, but think about what are the programs that are going to happen in the house that is going to integrate people with disabilities, those in recovery, back into the community so they can be successful and live good lives. Next slide. Is this me too?
Yep, this is your, yes, it's you.
My last slide? Okay.
Last one.
Okay, oh yes, this is my slide because this is us. Patient and flexible capital. So, again, not to kill you all with a lot of detail now. If you want to learn about any of this stuff offline, we can more than happy, to teach and everything else. But when we set up Disability Opportunity Fund it's almost 13 years ago, there was a very, very different way that housing was financed. It was, especially in group homes, it was like if you had a contract from that particular state, you'd walk into a bank, you get a 30-year mortgage, and very well you had a mortgage and improvements for a group home. Well, the challenge was that when managed care came into play, all of a sudden, that changed the dynamic. There were less group homes being created. There was more of a sense of self-determination. So when you end up with a situation like we did a few slides ago where a group comes in, whether it's just one family or a group of families or a not-for-profit, and says, hey, we have a new model and it hasn't been done before, well, as CDFIs, we have to listen very, very carefully. And the way that we've done our work, which we hope to always teach others, is we have 3 screens that we go through when we're looking at a particular situation. It could be single family, multifamily, it could be supportive, and that is on a basis of, we first start with public policy. Is the potential project consistent with public policy? The second aspect to it is we look at management. It could be a mom and a dad, or it could be a not-for-profit, or it could be a for-profit developer that's been doing a lot of good work. And we look at the management and say, are they good people? Do they understand this arena? Why are they doing it? What's their motivation and such? And then the third screen is, oh yeah, by the way, is it a good financial deal? Will they be able to borrow money, pay us back, and be able to run a housing situation? So I think that you have to look at your own CDFI. Now on the consumer side, I know there are a lot of consumer folks on the phone too. You may need help in terms of applications. How do you convert your applications into a more accessible process? You may need some more help in understanding, well, how do we, if we're going to look at a loan, maybe there's a program, let's say in New York State, there was a program called HOYO, Home of Your Own, for first-time home buyers. And you combine that with a CDFI being flexible and trying to understand it, and you may be able to, make the marriage there. So in terms of trying to be flexible about the way you approach this, and patient is very, very important. Again, you start with the idea first and make sure it's consistent with public policy. If it is, and if the numbers can work, then it's really a function of teaching, and you can go through educations with your loan committees. We've done that as well, to really teach them what's in the pipeline, what's coming down the pike, to prepare them for it, try to give them trends. I know that Desiree is on this call. Desiree is the type of resource that has all these different models that have been all over the country, that when I am taking a look at a new thing, I could reach out to someone like her and say, hey, is this consistent to what you're seeing around the country? You're the public policy expert. Are we going the right way or the wrong way? Is this going to be good or not? In terms of the bullets that you see on this slide at the end, sort of towards the end here, interrupting the cycle of incarceration, institutionalization, obviously trying to reduce substance abuse. These are the kinds of public policy focus that you don't have to learn about all of it today. What you have to be prepared for is when the borrower will come to your doorstep and say, hey, I have a new model, I have a new idea, hey, where do we go from here? You then can say, oh wait, this is what I learned about, this is, oh wait, this is new. What can I learn more about public policy-wise, then we can start getting into, okay, will we be able to make this a financial model that works? So here's a perfect example. We're, as I said, trying to deal with the substance abuse issue in West Virginia. The cost of a house and the renovations of a house in West Virginia are marginally, marginally lower than, obviously, a California or Florida or New York and such. So we're able to take a model that we think has worked elsewhere, bring it to West Virginia, and actually get more scale out of it because we could deploy more capital there and have more homes. So for us, it's also a function of learning the models, taking a look at your own resources, and then saying, okay, now how much more impact can we have? The last point I'll make on this, which I'll reiterate over and over and over again, is you should never be doing anything by yourselves. That's the point of this webinar. That's the point of all the trainings we've been doing basically for the last, 4 months or so. What you're on right now is a community. Carla mentioned it at the start of this discussion about the coalition we've created. There are no membership dues. Everyone should be signing up for it, because the more you utilize this community that's been doing it for a while, that learns from each other, there's no competition here, we participate in deals together, we clearly share information together, then you'll become your own expert and say, hey, wait, I just did this and it's exciting. Very, very nice that everyone took the time in the middle of everything else that's going on to be on this call. I think that's my last slide. So I'll still be on the call and I'll respond to any questions, but I think I'm handing it back. Is that right?
Yep, you are. Thank you, Charlie. So, and also, I want to bring to everyone's attention on the Zoom chat where Desiree reached out and she left her information, so that if anyone needs to reach out to her or would like to learn more, then she has left her email address here. So thank you very much, Desiree, for that. So Charlie, before you are totally gone, I have a question for you. The question says, this is valuable to know that this is a community, much needed. This is very useful. We want to implement in our area ASAP. How do we get Desiree's input also? So I would say to you, Arcana, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If I'm not, please forgive me. Desiree has given her email address. And so between, you have now Charlie's information as well as hers. So please feel free to reach out to both of them to get her input further. Okay, so let's move forward now. So now we're gonna bring back Lisa and Susan, and they are going to talk about housing choices for people with disabilities. So
Great.
want to kick it off?
So, sure, I'll start. This is Susan, because then I'm going to hand it over to Lisa. As Charlie was just talking about, some of what we as CDFIs do is we're looking into the future and trying to expand access, right? So public policy definitely plays a part in this. Housing choices for people with disabilities is in the thick of public policy. It's been there for years and it's going to continue for years. And essentially, people with disabilities want to be able to have a home of their own. And the two areas of public policy really are focused on whether this is concentrated housing or community integrated housing. And in looking at that, remembering that people with disabilities, not unlike all of us, often have support needs. And those supports, as we talked about in our in-person meetings, often they're informal supports, informal communities and our families, but also through government supports. The government will not fund segregated, isolationist type of housing situation. So you're separating housing from support. In Pennsylvania, and particularly, and in other places in the country, Vermont, for example, much in Washington State, and New Hampshire, there is no growth in group homes. There is no growth in institutional living. And institutions, if you can picture this, were very large buildings where people with disabilities were warehoused. And you know, our public policy has changed. People with disabilities, not unlike all of us, want to live in the community, but that can look different. So in the public policy debate, one of the drivers is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, otherwise known as CMS. And in January of 2014, CMS issued some rulings called the Home and Community-Based Settings Final Rule of what does integration look like? What does integrated settings look like? And then last year, March 22nd of 2019, they further, after hearing from advocates and families, people with disabilities, provider agencies, they sent out some frequently asked questions and those answers. I'm going to post that link in the chat room so that if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the public policy of what is, because you don't want to create an isolated housing setting, because people with disabilities, if they're moving in, won't get services. But what does isolationism look like? For example, a private home will not be isolated. Some gated communities, they might or might not look like isolation, and services would be able to come in. Because again, housing is one piece of the puzzle, and those of us who are CDFIs want to be able to be creating greater access, not limiting the possibilities. So I'll put in the web, into that chat room, that link, and Lisa, you can take it away.
Great. Thanks, Susan. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to give you examples of two of these different types of approaches to the policy of community integration. And it's all around the idea of giving people choice. You know, just like you and me, people with disabilities want to be able to choose. Some may want to live surrounded by people who are familiar with, you know, that they're familiar with and that face similar challenges. Other folks might want to live integrated into the community. So I'm going to give you two examples. I am with IFF, which is a Midwest CDFI. We're in an unusual position in that we are both a lender as a CDFI, but we're also a developer. So I'm going to give you two examples, one where we were a lender and one where we were the developer. And they each attack this community integration in a different way. So concentrated housing, and concentrated is a touchy word. It might be better to say like campus style housing, is a community integrated model that creates a campus and then invites others in. So in this, you know, it can be a single building, a campus, or a village model. And it is not gated off, it is not exclusive, but it creates a setting where people with disabilities have their services nearby and they are in an area that's familiar to them, and it's developed specifically for their needs. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is an example of a campus-style program that IFF did a loan on. This is Medina Creative Housing in Medina, Ohio. It's a campus-style social service program for people with disabilities. Now, when I said that in some cases community integration is creating a village and inviting people in, this is an example of that, because the campus includes independent living, housing, but it also has social enterprise employment opportunities, including a pet care facility and a cafe with a roastery, which provides employment opportunities for the folks who live on the campus, but it also invites other members of the community in to take advantage of those social enterprises. So this particular nonprofit was founded in '92 by a group of concerned parents who were trying to come up with a better alternative for their kids' futures. And you'll see that a lot. So much of what we're seeing right now in housing for people with disabilities is the families of adult men and women with disabilities who are trying to come up with an alternative for their adult kids. So in 2016, Medina requested a bridge loan to acquire a 5-acre parcel of land that had a single-story building on it. And the bridge loan gave them a chance to secure the site. They then developed 24 residential units of independent housing there for adults with developmental disabilities that were right next to the roastery and the pet care facility. And then the existing facility that was already there was renovated into a community center as well. So this is a version of integrated housing where folks are still living together, but they're not isolated. The next slide will give you another alternative. So then there's community integrated housing. This is also known as scattered site housing. It also usually offers folks access to services, but they're not necessarily on site because folks are in the communities themselves. This could be something like, you know, a couple of apartments that are inside of a larger apartment complex, or a 2 or 3 flat of housing that's on a residential street. Next slide. Now, this is an example of where IFF has been a developer, and this is something that you can replicate. I want folks to realize that these are models that you can do. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but like the others, I want to volunteer that you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to get you a lot more information on this. Home First is a project of IFF, and it was developed based on a relationship that we had with an advocate, the disability rights advocacy group, Access Living in Chicago. And they were pushing for truly community integrated housing options for people with disabilities, because those who were able to live completely on their own couldn't get the units that were wheelchair accessible. So this is let me see, we've done 3 of these now, 3 different Home First projects. They are a combination of low-income housing tax credit equity, federal home loan bank money, private foundation support from the Illinois Housing Development Authority, and it develops new and rehabbed 2 to 3 flat buildings scattered throughout a neighborhood that are, the ground floor will have 2 units that are fully wheelchair accessible, and the top floor will have accommodations for folks with non-mobility disabilities. But this is a model that we're not seeing done many other places, and we want to try to get the word out that this can be done. This particular project has won like 5 national awards now, because it's giving folks the opportunity to live in communities. They have access to fresh food, they have access to transportation, and it's preserving affordable housing in neighborhoods that are changing.
Lisa, can I speak? This is Susan. Could I speak in here for 2 seconds?
Please, please.
I personally, I love the illustration of the Home First for a couple of reasons. It brings in another opportunity for layered financing from CDFI. First, say for example, you need to make more than that first floor accessible. Someone on an upper floor that's renting or owns acquires a disability. You can bring in consumer lending for one thing, both basic consumer lending or the assistive technology lending, so that you could put in a porch lift or an elevator or say someone is aging in place and is really, mobility just becomes an issue, you can, for just like you would for anyone, start installing some smart home devices. The doorbells, the lights, the sensors, even if you're putting in, I'll just say Echo, because I'm more familiar with those products, the Amazon products, instead of seniors wearing the help alert buttons, if you have an Echo and a smartphone or a tablet, you can call for help if you fall. So you can layer in funding that way. We are doing a PATF, we are now in doing a pilot project with putting out capital to nonprofit organizations in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, to developers who are who have developed apartments and want to continue to rent to individuals with disabilities and seniors who are aging in place, and those needs change. So going back to some of what Lisa talked about, what is a reasonable accommodation? So we are lending at a very low cost capital to these developers so that they can make their apartments accessible, whether it's putting in grab bars, smart home devices, an elevator or ramp, but it is cost effective in many cases just to maintain that landlord-tenant relationship. It's far more difficult to have people coming and going from your property than making that apartment accessible when you've got a tenant who is a valued part of the community and, you know, pays their rent on time. And that's another example of how you can kind of layer the financing there.
Thanks, Susan. That's a good point. And it's also important to note that the beauty of a scattered site project like Home First is that you can expand or contract it to meet your needs, to meet the resources you have available, to meet the, you know, if say the county comes to you, the county land bank, and says, we have these 6 lots that are on our rolls, we need to get rid of them. We will give them to you for $1 if you develop housing on them. So all of a sudden we can do a six lot project. We put 3 units on each. That's 18 units of housing with no land acquisition cost. So the first Home First that was done was actually when the condo market crashed, and it took advantage of all of these condos that were sitting vacant on the market, dragging down their homeowner associations because no one was paying the HOA fees. We snatched those up if they were in buildings that had elevators, renovated them to make sure that the doorways were wide enough and the bathrooms had the turning radius necessary, changed up the kitchens, and were able then to rent them to people who use wheelchairs that were coming out of nursing homes, which under the Olmstead ruling of the Supreme Court, you know, we are trying to get people out of nursing homes and into the communities. So if, you know, that was a great example of a market opportunity and having flexible capital. We partnered with the Illinois State Housing Development Authority, got some grant money, pulled in a little bit of foundation money, and we were able to move on that fairly quickly. So then this one, this access housing, that was 54 units. We found another pot of money for permanent supportive housing that wanted to do a smaller project. So we successfully got 20 units of housing funded through that. So it's a very flexible, creative way to provide housing for people with disabilities. And I will put my name and contact information in the comments so I can get you more information later. I'm aware of the time and I'm talking quickly to not hog all the time that's left.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. What you had to say was very valuable, so you were not taking up too much time at all. And thank you, Susan, as well. So let's see, CDFIs, and I've talked about this a little earlier. So CDFIs can partner with state housing finance agencies. They can be a very effective partner for CDFIs by providing that very much needed layered financing and flexible financing that can be used for affordable housing with people with disabilities. And it's, you know, this includes all types of disability projects. So again, I encourage you that if you are not familiar with your state housing finance agency, that you become familiar, go on their website. They typically will list what their projects are, you know, meet with your representatives, as well as, and let's extend this to not only the state housing finance agency, but also in the jurisdiction and the cities and the counties where you work, they're partner with them as well. That's a very much needed resource for your borrowers. Okay, so. All right. So before we go to the key takeaways, we did have, well, actually, Holly, I'm going to hold this question because we're going to open it up for questions, and this will be the kickoff point for that part. So real quick, the key takeaways from today's webinars are CDFIs can be a part of the solution in combating housing discrimination for people with disabilities. We talked about that through different housing policies. So get involved with your officials, both your local officials as well as your congressional members when they come home to your areas. And then come up here to DC on Capitol Hill and be a part of that as well. And also CDFIs can help people with disabilities obtain smart home technology and devices through various financing options. We talked about that in terms of, one, educating yourself in terms of what they are. Hopefully this webinar gave you a good sense of that. And also, if you don't provide those financing, like say for example, you may do housing, but you may not do consumer lending, but find your CDFI partners that you can work with that can provide any kind of other types of financing. And then CDFI should explore and understand the housing choices for people with disabilities. You know, the panelists did a great job of explaining all of those. And then we as CDFI should consider financing supportive housing projects. You know, that was, and all the different types that were mentioned. Okay, so next slide. So the next slide actually talks about is additional resources. So there's actually two different slides that has links about some resources. And if you notice that even within the webinar, there were a few links of references of where the materials came from that pertain to that particular side. So, you know, we encourage you to look at both of these slides, this one as well as the next one, and, you know, do some research. Also, each of us, the panelists, have given their contact information. Lisa has just given her information as well. Charlie gave his, Susan, I gave mine. So you have all of our information. And then, so I guess that's it. We can open up for questions at this point. And let's start out. So Holly actually had a question. And Holly, your question that you had is, IFF is a great developer CDFI. I totally agree with you. Is there a list or membership organization to find more developers like IFF? So Holly, you've had trouble finding developers focusing on this work. And so Lisa, you said you happy to talk details about her offline. Is there anything that, Lisa, you wanted to share with the whole group in regards to her question?
I intended to make that available to everyone. I'm old and I don't do well with tech, so my apologies. Please do share my email with everyone. I'm happy to talk to folks.
Okay, and you did. You gave it to all the panelists, so they had it all. Okay, so are there any other questions? You all have been really great. You stuck with us throughout this webinar, so hopefully you found this information very useful. So any other questions? So Charlie, Lisa, Susan, any words of wisdom to close out this webinar? Okay.
None from me, thank you.
Okay, yes, everyone was very thorough. Okay, so let's see. Oh, thank you so much.
Carla, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay, so I just want to leave, before everyone leaves the call, again, there are a lot of folks on this attendee list that I don't recognize. This whole arena is just getting started. There's a lot of history to it, but it's just getting started in terms of what the new models are. Geographically, it's going to be all over the United States in terms of the subject matter and in terms of the acceptability of these kind of things. So patience, inquisitiveness, willingness to come and ask questions, we're all here. And we really do encourage you. Carla, is there a way for us to also post what should we do in terms of communication if they want to join the coalition?
We can get something out to them after this presentation.
All right, great, great. And as we said, we created this thing in 2014 as a coalition. We all have other memberships that we have to pay money for, all the different groups. We're trying to do this one with no membership dues so that the more people we have talking to each other and getting involved, the better for everybody. So please do it, and you can sign up as many people as you want from your organization, and it's going to keep you in the loop as to what's going on.
So we have a question that came in, and this question came in from Quincy. And so Quincy says several examples dealt with housing in areas with lower cost of living. Can you talk about any issues faced in New York City or higher cost living areas?
Absolutely. So, I mean, and I'm based in New York, so we deal with this all the time. So I think that it's a very long conversation that we can, again, if you're here in New York or if you're in an area you want to discuss, we can do that offline. It's just a very different set of parameters of which agencies you're going to talk to. Again, if you're talking New York City, the 5 boroughs, all of a sudden you're layering on top of everything we've talked about with state financing and Social Security and everything else. Now all of a sudden you're layering on New York City and the availability of resources. But it's going to be a function of navigation and such, and partnerships and such. So it's not to dismiss the high rent districts. It's just to say that, look, there's a way to do it. It's very difficult. It's not very easy. But depending on who the administration is and who the players are, there are opportunities to do it. I will tell you, in a place that you get dense population like in New York City or in California or others, what the replacement of housing solutions where the government used to take care of everything, what we are finding in our experience over the last 12 years is when you take a subject matter like autism or such, there's always in the socioeconomic aspect, families that are in a higher socioeconomic category that are willing to invest their own time and money to then have, for socialization purposes, their son or daughter living with people who can't afford it. And in essence, it creates a very weird and dynamic subsidy that you wouldn't have thought about otherwise, because everyone always looks to the government for the subsidies. So very, very long conversation that needs to happen offline, but yes, there obviously is a very big market that needs to be attacked in the high density populations.
This is Susan, because we're from Philadelphia, although we're not as high rent as New York. And that's why retrofitting and helping people age in place is important. Carla also mentioned working with the state's housing finance agencies, because they often have capital to help people with disabilities with the first-time homeowners. Then they have second soft mortgages and third mortgages so that you can layer financing. I just put into the chat box, there's an organization of lawyers that's throughout Pennsylvania, Regional Housing Legal Services. They may have, agencies, similar agencies in other states, but these are attorneys who understand financing, housing, connections with nonprofits, developers, again, people with disabilities and their families to create new housing plans. So whether it is new apartments, looking at housing tax credits, advocating for some of the Section 8 housing choice vouchers, whatever it is, they are a wonderful resource. I am sure you could reach into them, look at their publications, see how they're doing it. And as Charlie said, at least in Pennsylvania, the government is not as involved, the social service network is not involved as much in providing the housing. So this has to be outside financing and families and individuals with disabilities working with others. And so anyway, I think Regional Housing Legal Services is one of the gifts that we have here in Pennsylvania.
I'd like to piggyback on that just very quickly to say that I think that dense urban settings and lower cost rural settings each have their own set of challenges. I know that the model we're doing, Home First, has been really successful in urban settings because, yes, you have to work a little bit harder for resources, and some states have more resources set aside for people with disabilities than others. But in our case, since we were in the city, we were going into areas that were gentrifying, and we were getting credit for preserving affordable housing. So part of it is really knowing the lay of the land, knowing what the policy priorities are in the areas that you want to be in, and figuring out how to make the most of those.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So before I turn it over to DeBrittany, want to say a couple of things. One, on behalf of, and someone asked this question, it's the name of the coalition of what the presenters, the board we're on, is National Disability Finance Coalition. Also, let's see, you will get a survey. So please, we'd love to hear your comments on the survey. And also, DeBrittany will talk about a follow-up email and what will be contained in that email. So I pass it on to you, DeBrittany, to close us out.
Thank you, Carla. That was a perfect segue. So in closing, I'd like to thank, first of all the presenters, including Carla, Susan, Charlie, Lisa, and Tanisha for a great webinar. And also to mention that if you have any follow-up questions, you can direct them to cdfi@bctpartners.com. Speaking of that email address, that is the email address that you will receive the follow-up email to this webinar from. The email will contain a link to the recording of this webinar, a copy of the transcript that was provided today, as well as all of the contact information for the presenters that you heard. In addition, I'd like to remind everyone that we have a website for this initiative at www.accessforall.info. That is also where you will find any information regarding upcoming webinars, technical assistance, and training events. Finally, if you have not already seen the link to the webinar evaluation in the chat box, as Carla mentioned, we like to ask everyone to please submit your comments and feedback on today's webinar there as soon as possible. Thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.